Well, I'll tell you what got me interested in this. It began in my early teens, and in retrospect, as I look back on it, that seed is also, though I didn't quite know this then, why I think these shapes of the states are important and not just a curiosity. There were two events when I was in 7th grade, I think both times. The first was I had a geography teacher who, despite the story I'm about to tell you, was actually a wonderful teacher. And this wasn't such a terrible story either, but she had a game that we would play where she would hold up cutouts of the states, and we would raise our hands and try to guess which state it was. And I loved it. I don't know quite how many years later I looked back on that somewhat more critically and thought, well, I guess what we were learning is what is the shape of New York, for instance, but not why is the shape of New York. And that there's so much more value in knowing why a set of conditions exist than simply accepting those conditions and committing them to memory. Around the same time, it may have even been in the same class. I grew up here in Maryland, or there in Maryland, as the city paper points out. And every day, I believe it was that geography class, there was a map the United States pulled down, there was a map the state of Maryland pulled down. I'd seen that Maryland map all my life. And around that time, about age 13, I remember looking at it and thinking, what is this thing? How did this happen? Why is it missing half a rectangle off the eastern end? And I looked and realized that that's Delaware. And thinking, why do we have Delaware? You know, I mean, Maryland wouldn't be that big if it had Delaware. Do we really need Delaware? And that became the seed of this. It was augmented for me when, after public school, I went to the University of Wisconsin, and now I'm seeing the Wisconsin map all the time, and realized, wait a minute, there's a peninsula off the northeast corner of Wisconsin, and it's Michigan. You know, it doesn't even touch Michigan. As my younger son would have said when he was about 2 years old, how that can be. And so ultimately, I took decades. I got out of my chair and went and found out, resulting in this book. And what I want to do here is just spend a few minutes talking about some of the broad strokes of the American map, and then with your questions, we can talk about any specific state that you're particularly interested in. And the first thing I would want to direct your attention to is the oldest part of the country, the 13 colonies. And if you've got one of these maps, there they are. One thing that becomes evident if you just kind of glance at that iconic American map is that the 13 colonies are far more diverse in size than most of the other states. California and Texas we'll come to in a moment, but there's not the kind of equality of size that we tend to see through, let's say, the middle of the country and into the Northwest. And that becomes even more apparent if you enhance the 13 states to their size at the end of the Revolution. And that's what the colors are here. So that Georgia included what is now Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi after the Revolution. North Carolina still included Tennessee, Virginia, Kentucky, West Virginia. And one I would point out in particular is that Massachusetts still held Maine. These had evolved from the colonial boundaries over time, but at the point that the Revolution ended, this is what this country inherited in terms of states. Congress did two things right off the bat that reveal how implicit it was in the thinking of Congress and how differently Congress would create states from the way a monarch would create states. And that was, it did two things to try to equalize, to say that all states should be created equal. Now, one thing it did was it created a bicameral legislature so that we had to try to level the playing field we inherited, so that we have a Senate where everybody has 2 votes, every state has 2 votes, House of Representatives is by population, try to level the playing field between, say, Rhode Island and New York, if you will. The other thing it did was it urged and ultimately succeeded in getting these larger states to cede to the United States government their land west of the Appalachian Mountains, so that we ended up with the Mississippi Territory, which later became Mississippi, Alabama. We ended up with Tennessee, Kentucky, and so forth, with more equal states. I don't want to sound like things were too wonderful and ideal at this point. There were darker reasons that these states ceded this land. The southern states were happy to do it because with every state they created, 2 more pro-slavery votes in the Senate. So slavery, in particular, was a driving force operating in concert with the effort to create equal states. But in general, what I'm trying to stress is that the shape of the states that were created by the monarchs are different because the monarch did not have on his screen, and in one case her screen, equality among the states. It just wasn't an issue to them. If it behooved the crown, and it did, to create a real little colony called Rhode Island for purposes of religious tolerance, and thereby relieve the potential for some real problems up there in Massachusetts, where there was such intolerance that they were burning people at the stake, the Crown would create such a colony and not be terribly concerned whether Rhode Island was equal to Massachusetts, not be at all concerned, not even think twice about it. Not a bad thing, it's just that wasn't their part of their implicit thinking. It was part of Congress's, though, after the Revolution. The second thing I wanted to just kind of point out in general about the spread out of the map is that there were two major developments pretty early in this country that affected where a lot of the state lines are. The first was in 1808, I believe it was, the Erie Canal was proposed. Now, by the time prior to that, Thomas Jefferson had already laid out proposals for how to divide the land in what we today pretty much call the Midwest. Back then it was called the Northwest Territory. This was land we inherited when we became a nation that the British and its colonists had won in the French and Indian War. It's the land between the Mississippi and the Ohio River. And it is today Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, parts of Minnesota. Jefferson had the job of saying, what do we do with this? How do we turn this into states? And he came up with a system of lines. Those lines were not followed. The principle was because he created very equally sized areas, but they didn't follow his particular ones. But even with that, the Erie Canal changed a lot of Jefferson's proposed lines. So that if you look at the map around the Great Lakes, you'll notice that every state in that vicinity has access to the Great Lakes, because once the Erie Canal was proposed, they weren't lakes anymore. Now they were a vital avenue of commerce from the hinterlands through the canal, through the lakes to the canal to the Hudson River to the ocean. Very, very important before railroads. So much so that as these territories became states, Congress adjusted their boundaries accordingly. So you'll see Pennsylvania in the northwest corner has a little tab that sticks up. Ohio and Indiana form the bottom of Michigan, but it's not a single straight line. You'll see that Ohio is a little bit angled there. That's so that it could have the port at Toledo, which is where the Maumee River, which runs through western Ohio, empties into Lake Erie. Very important for Ohio to have that port. Indiana got moved up 10 miles so it could have the port at Gary. Illinois, very interesting story, we might talk about it later, got 60 miles of Wisconsin. And Wisconsin also lost land that normally it would have had following the Mississippi River. What you're seeing on the map is that kind of pointed area of northern Minnesota, that triangle, big triangle up at the top. That would have been Wisconsin. But Congress gave that to whatever state would be created west of Wisconsin, turned out to be Minnesota, so that state too would have frontage on the Mississippi River, frontage on Lake Superior, and a port, which is Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Duluth. So Erie Canal, one of the big factors. The very thing that actually undermined the Erie Canal came along later and had an equally huge impact on the map, and that was railroads. Because once railroads were developed, rivers, although very, very important, were no longer so vital that they would almost always be used, if at all possible, as the boundary between two entities. And that's why as you just kind of scan your eye across the American map from the east to the west, all those curly lines, those jagged lines, many of which are rivers, some of them are mountain crests, they start straightening out. So that by the time you get to the, western states, they in fact predominate.